Right, so hacking 9 to 5, a day in the life of. So thank you for all being patient and staying with me through the problems. It's working now, it's all that matters. So that's it. So this talk is about pen testing and what to expect in the daily life of. So I'm a pen tester and have been pen testing for Quorum Cyber for 3 years now. Prior to that, I have been pen testing for another 3 years, so cumulative 6 years pen testing experience. And I was an ethical hacking student here in Abertay, and I graduated in 2016. So that's a basic summary of me. So how many of you have thought about being pen testers? Okay. And how many of you have given other areas of cybersecurity a thought, or is it just it's a lot of you? So that's perfect. So that's it. So, as I say, this talk is about what to expect as a pen tester. The reason for this talk was when I was a student here, I kind of knew I wanted to be a pen tester. I knew what I wanted to do, but there wasn't a lot of information about what to expect out there. So pen testing isn't exactly what I was expecting when I graduated, but I'm glad that it's not, and it's basically helped refine me to this professional that I am now. So it's going to cover the engagements that are frequently encountered on a pen test engagement. Frequently encountered in general, not just on pen test engagements. And it's basically aimed towards people who are looking to take their first steps into pen testing. So this is just a brief summary of my day-to-day overview. Luckily, at Quorum Cyber, I get the ability to work from home, so I can wake up relatively late, so to speak, still before 9. It's quite good if you're a bit of a bad morning person. I get out of my bed, I can make myself a coffee, have some breakfast, get down to my office and check my emails, direct messages, reply to reply to people who've contacted me. Could that be clients? Could that be employees looking for help? Just basically assist them. Once that's started, then start my day testing and just juggle my testing through the day between the meetings that I carry out. So the penetration testing journey. So it's not just testing. So that's the first thing I'd like to say. People just expect you're going to be put out in front of people and you're given a website to test or you're given infrastructure to test. It's not always that. It's a whole journey from start to finish whereby you interact with the clients at an early stage and through to the final close of the engagement. So there's three sort of main sections here, as you see: the pre-sales, the delivery, and the reporting stage. So we're going to start off with your pre-sales stuff. So initially, you are first brought into your sort of pen testing engagement and pen testing environment in your scope and call with the customer. So the customer calls you and basically says, "Look, I'm looking for this test. I want a pen test done." And pen test means very different things to different people. So people come in like, "I want a pen test." They've heard the term. That's what they want. And so it's our jobs, along with the salespeople, to find out exactly why they want testing, exactly what they want tested, and what elements they are most concerned about. So this is your first interaction with the client, as I've mentioned. To me, it's important. You are the face of the testing team. At this stage, you need to paint this professional image to help the company give off this good ethos to make sure that they are the right person for the test engagement with the customers. So it gives you the chance to ask them questions I've mentioned. So you kind of want to understand why they're wanting testing done. So is it for compliance reasons? Is it they want to improve their security posture? Or is it just they have to have a checkbox, little book saying a customer wants us to get a pen test done? Can we get something? So you get this whole spectrum of people coming in for tests. As I say, you get to ask your relevant questions. So I had someone come up to me earlier on today for the day asking if we carry out load balancing testing. So obviously we don't carry out load balancing testing, so it's denial of service. If you were to DOS a customer's real environment, that's bad. You don't want to cost them money, you don't want to have downtime for them. So one of the questions you could ask at the scoping stage is, for example, is do you have a UAT environment? So do you have a testing environment? Do you have a development environment? And if so, does this directly replicate live? And obviously, the reason behind this is to make sure that this environment can be used as an alternative for testing. So you can be a bit more free reign. You can basically go out a little bit more vigorously without worrying about knocking it over or polluting their live databases. So again, it's just basically making sure that the customer has a good overall experience of testing, a good overall experience of the engagement. So if you have a bad engagement, they're less likely to come back. It just helps paint a better image. And ultimately, it gets you to the point whereby you can understand what services they would actually benefit from. So that pen test term's thrown around. They come in saying, I want a web test, or I want an internal test. You've asked questions and you've found out that their main concern is their external posture. So why have they asked? They say they want an internal test. If their main concern is their external facing network, you would tailor something around this, and then you would say the end goal is to ultimately get you to the point whereby your concern would then move to your internal aspect. And then at that point, we could then carry out an internal test. So the next stage of testing is your sales support and proposal writing. So you've collected all this information from the client on the scoping section. You have asked them the questions, you've noted it down, and this is the point whereby you help create the first document that is delivered to the client. So this, in my opinion, is an important, very important document, because from the get-go, this is the standard of work that they would be thinking about expecting. So to me, it's important that it's clear, concise, and basically just easy to follow, and so they can understand exactly what they are getting. So again, I've said clear and concise. The completeness is important, as I mentioned. So you want this document to summarize testing. You want it to include the targets that the customer is wanting tested. And you want to include the effort. And if it's an objective-based test, you want to include the objectives. So at the end of the day, the tester who comes behind you to do this engagement can get the one document there and be like, this is my target, this is what I want, and then they can go to do it. So following on from your sales support, you get to your active delivery of the engagement, the testing. So to me, this is the bit where I get most enjoyment. Not that the other bits are bad. It's obviously just what I enjoy. It's why I do pen testing. So as I say, this is the active delivery. So prior to testing, you have a couple of prerequisites. So you can't just target anything. You kind of need to, you do need to have appropriate authorization in place. You can't just randomly hit a website. If you do, you're obviously not in authorization. You're breaking the Computer Misuse Act. So you want to make sure everything is in place, that you have written consent saying you have authorization to test this target between this date and this date. And if anything were to go wrong, you can go back and say, well, actually, you've said here that I'm allowed to do this, and obviously you've signed our terms and conditions, and that's fine. And you, again, in discussion with the targets, you want to make sure they are exactly what is expected. If there's any doubt ever in place, you just go back to the client and be like, look, I've got this discrepancy. Is this to be expected? And again, it's basically covering yourself to make sure that you are actually hitting what you have authorization for and basically are ready to do. Again, prior to testing, you need to provide the organizations your testing IP ranges. This is so if they have any WAFs or web application firewall or an intrusion prevention system, they can allow you through it. So obviously, attackers have unlimited time. Whereas us, as pen testers, we have a set duration of time. We can try to get around the WAF and the IPS. However, with the time there, it's not going to... With the time restriction we have, it might not be possible. It might just continually deny us testing. So if you allow us through, we've got a greater chance of covering the basic coverage of the application and make sure that it's basically we find as many possible issues in the testing window that we have. Another important thing for testing is continual communication with clients. So if you have an engagement, in my opinion, it's important to liaise with your target. If you speak to them, you are basically saying, look, I'm about to start testing on the day. I'm about to stop testing. So that way they can keep an eye on anything that's happening. And if anything happens out with this allocated window, they know it's not us, and they can treat it as a real incident and follow the correct escalation protocols that they have in place, or escalation policies. In line with communication, critical issues should always be communicated as quickly as possible to the client. So, for example, if you found a SQL injection, and this SQL injection allows you back-end access to their database, you can get password hashes for their application users. You don't want this to be publicly accessible for a prolonged duration of time. You'd always want to phone up the client. Once you've obviously got your proof that it is possible, you phone up the client by, look, I found this issue here, and this issue is replicable by following these steps, and it allows them to mitigate the issue whilst you're testing. So that way, once they've done it, you can follow back and say, this issue is no longer present. You have successfully been able to resolve it. And despite this, you would still include that in the report. This is just basically so that they have an audit trail that it was there, and you can then document that, saying that the development team have followed good practice. They responded in a timely manner to resolve the issue. That is important in a pen test report as well, which I will discuss later. Is basically you don't always want it to be negative. You want to put in positives as well. So a pen test report can be a negative thing, but you want to try to put a positive spin on it, so that we're not just tearing down what work's been put in place. You want to reaffirm what's done well. So you're reporting. So this is arguably the most important element for the client, for the test. So everything prior to this has just been it's just been theoretical. You say you've done your testing. You say you've done this. But what has the client got to show at this point? Nothing. They have literally nothing to show that you have done any work. So arguably it's the most important element. And as I say, ultimately it's the product that the customer pays for. So the important factors in a report is you want the report to be clear. So you want to say, this is the issue, and I found it in such and such a location. So I found an XSS issue within the search functionality on your website. Then you want to be concise and say basically what the impact is. So the impact of XSS is obviously what it is. And you want the report to be the issue be replicable. So you want to supply some sort of proof, like a GET request, so that they can literally copy and paste it directly into the URL. So once they have addressed the issue, they can test themselves whether or not the issue is still present. So this is why it's important. So they need this audit trail to say the work's been done. Once the work's been done, you're telling them where all their issues are, and you're giving them the point whereby they can resolve them, they can address the issues. So status tracking as well. As I've mentioned, for example, the SQL injection, stuff that I mentioned a minute ago, they hypothetically remediated that during the test. By having this ability to status track, we can then mark that as the issue has been remediated, rather than just putting in a different section in the report. So again, as I've mentioned, communication on areas that were implemented well. If you can communicate what you've done well, that helps the organisation justify the development team, which in the end will help justify the testing that they're carrying out. So once testing's been done, there is a post-test follow-up section. So this is the chance to touch base with the client again. This is where they've had the report for a couple of weeks. You can speak to them and say, look, do you have any questions about any of the findings? Or is there anything that we can offer you further that's not been covered in this report? And it just opens up the communication channels again, and it allows them to provide feedback on what they experienced was good and what they experienced was bad. So that we can basically refine the process and help care for better engagements moving forward. So that's the basic summary of the pen testing journey. So hopefully that gets across the point of it. It's not just your testing and that there is other elements to it. So after that, how many of you are still thinking about pen testing? Okay, so I've not put too many people off, so that's good. So we're going to cover the types of testing experience as a new tester. I can only speak on my behalf. So these are the type of things that I experienced when I graduated in my first role, and ultimately they helped shape me into the tester that I am now and hit home the basics that I've learnt and used throughout my job so far. So the first type of testing that you would experience as a new tester could be your web application testing. And your web application testing has sort of three main categories. Your brochureware, your unauthenticated, and your authenticated testing. So have any of you heard of brochureware testing before? No. That's right. So brochureware testing can be described as purely an informational site with no sort of login element, no way for clients to use further functionality than what's present on the application. So your brochureware is sort of an informational website. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, but I can't. Whereby it's just information supplied to them and they read off it and that's it. Your unauthenticated testing is obviously when your client gives you a web application and they say try to break in, try to bypass the authentication mechanism and see what you can do as if you were an illegitimate attacker who is trying to just break in. So unauthenticated testing can have some authenticated element if you find a self-registration page on the application. If it has this self-registration, you are within scope to then follow through the self-registration process and then test the authenticated element behind. And your third main category of web application testing is your authenticated content. So your authenticated type of testing. This is when it's an application that doesn't allow self-registration. It is just purely a website, for example, employees' use. But without having an employee number or some sort of way of identifying who you are, you cannot self-register. So that's that. And that's basically the three main categories. So these web application engagements can be tailored to clients' needs. So not every client, as I've mentioned, has the same requirements. They can be objective-based, coverage-based, or focused on risk levels. So it all depends on what your client's budget is and what you've discussed in the scoping section. So if it's an objective-based test, for example, get to this back-end database. That's your objective. If you can't demonstrate this objective, it's not been a successful test. It has been because obviously you've demonstrated it's not possible. Whereas your coverage-based is, here's a web app, find as much as you can. And your specific risk levels could be for clients who don't have much of a budget, but are, look, I'm only interested in highs and criticals. Find them, report them. That's it. So some good things that I've used for learning web application testing has been like the OSCP. I learned a lot about web application testing doing that when I've done it. Understandably, it's changed from when I first passed. However, I can only speak on my experience of it. There is good learning opportunities there to basically learn the basic fundamentals that can help shape your career. So your web application testing typically follows a methodology. And this methodology helps ensure that you're covering the applications in full and complete scope. So, for example, some methodologies are your OWASP or your OSSTMM. Typically, you'll find people use a hybrid of both, and they all have their own specific one that they use, and basically use it to ensure that the application is covered off. So, these methodologies all follow a basic structure. And the basic structure is your reconnaissance. So this is your Nmap scans of the website, what information can be found, can this information, it's basically painting a picture of that. And this information can be then used to tailor towards further attacks. Your server levels. So if the client wants your underlying infrastructure done, you would then start trying to touch these ports that have been found open. You see if there's anything that can be exploited at infrastructure level. And you would then move on to your authentication issues. So authentication issues are a lot more common than what you'd expect. So some real life examples of what I have found during testing with authentication issues is, does it actually check for a password? So you think surely all applications nowadays would check whether or not a password is present. However, there's a vulnerability called failopen, whereby it is only checking for the username string. And once you've sent the request, you can then delete the password and you're able to log in. I found that quite recently on a web application test I was doing and was able to log in without having a password. Not good when you're a large company who is trying to care for clients and all their sensitive information is present. So that was basically I was able to take advantage of that from an unauthenticated point to authenticate into the application without having any valid credential sets. So another example of an authentication issue is, does an application actually check for the session token? Does it not? So one that I was able to do on a very similar application to the aforementioned one was, it was using a header. So the header's name was, for example, username : it was like my name, Mark Rose, is the token. However, I was able to change this to admin and successfully become an admin just by changing one word once I had logged in. So going from low level to admin was a case of just deleting a word and adding in another. Again, ultimately, these are simple security issues that you need to look for as a tester. So the next level after that would be your authentication, as I've just mentioned. Your authorization issues. So authorization issues lie around your, for example, insecure direct object reference. How many of you know what IDOR is? Okay, perfect. So a couple of you. So basically, within the URL, there could be, example, an ID equals 12. If you're able to abuse that, you are then able to then access a resource that you're not supposed to have access to. So another example that I found when testing a web app was, I logged in, went to my profile section of the application, and I noticed within the requests they was using a backend API, and within the API URL there was, for example, get/API/user 12/profile. So I was able to change that /12 to /1 to view the admin page. Once I had viewed the admin page, I noticed I was actually able to edit. So it wasn't checking to make sure I had the proper authority to edit this page. Once I was there, I decided, I'm going to change this admin's email address. So admin's email address then was changed to mine. I was able to use the forgotten your password function once I logged out to reset the admin's password to log in as an admin. So that was that. And you have your miscellaneous /injection issues. So this is where you would test for your likes of your XSS, your SQL injection, your XXE, and your server-side request forgery. So server-side request forgery is when you're able to trick the back-end server into making a request to a resource that you control. So another example of vulnerability that I found whilst testing was one of the applications allowed a user to create a list. This list was then created, and when it was created, it made a request, and it looked for a specific image as a cover photo. So what you could do is you could change this cover photo to a URL that is in your control, and that was the list saved. At that point, there was nothing wrong. Your image was just loaded in. But what this web application allowed you to do, it allowed you to export this list to a PDF. And once the list was exported, the server looked for the image, because obviously it puts it in this PDF, and the server then made a request to the asset that you're in control of, and that's it. You have control of the server. At that point, you're able to gain remote access if you play your cards right. So the next type of testing that I experienced as a graduate was external infrastructure. So external infrastructure is an assessment of your perimeter systems. So this is typically a client who comes and like, I want to know what everything that's out there that we own. Can you tell us? So yes, we can, but we would do your external infrastructure. And allows the clients to gain an understanding of their security posture and determine if the firewall rules that they have implemented are correct. And if so, we tell them this is what's found. They can then go back to their firewall and be like, yep, that matches, we're all good. Or if not, we found, for example, a RDP connection, so we're able to gain a remote desktop into this environment, and we could potentially use the information we gained previously in the engagement to obtain a valid credential set to then log in and have access to their internal network. And then from there, you'd start trying to move laterally and vertically to obtain domain admin and basically be in control. So your approach for an external infrastructure test varies on client requirements. So some clients only want a low interaction where we run a tool and we give them the output. So it's a bit boring and you only kind of verify your manual stuff, your critical or high stuff. However, this is good in some aspects, but it doesn't, in my opinion, allow complete coverage. Whereas my personal approach to external infrastructure would be what I would call high interaction, whereby we do everything possible. So we found a SMTP port open, for example. So that's mail, for example, your emails. So can we connect into this mail port? Yes. Once we connect in, is it possible to mail spoof? So mail spoofing is the ability to pretend to belong within this organization. So you would issue the correct commands to say, I am, for example, Mark at thiscompany.com, and I want to send this email to my contact at thiscompany.com. And then from there, you could, if the client then replies back saying, yep, that's, I received that email, that's fine. It could be used, for example, phishing or whaling, where you start trying to target your more high level up people in the company to obtain a valid credential set, which could be then used in correlation with that RDP port that I've hypothetically made up in my head to log in. And that's it. You've then become, for example, the IT man of the company. And then at that point, you can do what you want. And again, the testing structure and methodology for the external infrastructure element is more varied. There's not, for example, an exact thing you should follow. It all depends on the services that are located during the testing window. And the third one you might experience during testing is what we call an assumed breach. So have any of you heard of assumed breach testing before? No. So assumed breach testing is ultimately an assessment of the organization's internal network. It's similar to an internal test, however, we are taking the point on their network that we have previously discussed with them. So the point or the perspective could be, for example, we walked into their organization, we've plugged in a laptop, what can we see we can do? So can we obtain a password hash using the tools? And can we replay this password hash to then start impersonating this user? Or we can mimic an account being compromised via phishing. So we would use a command and control center to send an email to the organization and try to trick their end users into clicking this link, which would then provide the hook back into our command and control center, and we can start trying to move laterally or vertically around their environments to obtain domain admin. Another way we could look at this is your credentials compromised. So they just provide us credentials. So we've pretended that we've compromised these credential sets with them. They've provided them. We can log in and then ultimately run the exact command that we need to get the hook back to the command and control. So as you can see, there's various different ways that we can do this. And it all comes down to client budget again, which you have communicated with and you've tailored it to their requirements. So I hope you can see that pen test isn't just testing as you may think. There's a lot of communication with the client prior, a lot of communication during, and a lot of communication after. And your assume breach testing is often objective driven. So it's not a case of what can you find. It's an objective driven test. So can you get to domain admin? So for example, I was testing an organization's internal network. They said, right, can you get to DA? So obviously, as the tester, you obviously want to make sure that you meet their goal and that it is possible. So for example, an example I found during testing was a client had multiple network shares visible. Within their network shares, there was a member of the IT team who had their folders accessible to everyone on the network. Within these folders, there was a registry key. And within the registry key, there was a username and password in clear text for a service account. And there was basically, if I recall correctly, there was 5 or 6 of these service accounts, each one incremented by 1. And you had, with compromising this registry key, you had the password and username combination for all 6 users. So once you found that, I went back to a tool that we use called Bloodhound. So basically it's an ingester for Sharphound whereby it assesses that the directory in a quick manner. You put it in and it visualizes the output at a high level, that's it. And I basically right-clicked and said, I've compromised this user. What is the shortest path to domain admin from here? Turned out that user had write-all access on, and I was able to use the write-all access to make myself a domain user. And that was it. So that was it. Okay, and other types of testing that we do now, and other types of testing that are available are, so you're basically telling you that you aren't just tied into 1 or 2 types of testing. There is a large volume you can go into and you can specialize in whatever you want. So the other types of testing that are available are your mobile applications, so your iOS and your Android application testing. Are you able to find any issues within that? So I must admit I'm not a master in any of the testing I've mentioned or this, but you just mentioned the other stuff that are available. Your source code review. So the client provides you the source code of the application to find vulnerabilities. So a source code review can be provided alongside a web app test. And I personally would call that a source code driven pen test. So you can use the web application front end that you have, and you can use the source code that's provided to kind of tailor the issues and find them in a faster manner than if you were looking at one another. Your breakout testing, so if a client uses a Citrix environment, which is a lockdown desktop, for you don't know, are you able to break out this environment to gain a command prompt and then start trying to move laterally like the assume breach testing that I've just mentioned? Your social engineering testing, so are you able to break into a building? Can you use the information provided to gain physical access? Can you use public information to obtain valid credential sets like your phishing? Your wireless assessments, you just walk in, scan the wireless, that's it. Web service assessment, API, your vulnerability assessments, which ties into your external sort of infrastructure, again, you just run the vulnerability scan. And your cloud security assessments, with the cloud becoming more common now. So common tooling that I experience as a tester is Burp Suite, Nikto, WP, so it's just a list. I'll let you read it rather than reading it out loud. And that's it. So all these tools are worth learning and worth investigating. So that's the end of the talk. Does anyone have any questions or anything? Yes.
How long do you usually have to do the testing?
So it varies on what the client wants, but typically a web application test would be 5 days worth of effort on a common web application. External infrastructure, it varies depending on the IP addresses and the services that they have. So commonly you're looking at, again, like 3-4 days if it's not a large volume.
You mentioned lateral and sort of vertical movement.
Yes.
What do you kind of mean by that in terms of when you're doing that form of testing?
Okay, so I probably should have explained that whilst I was doing it, but it's a good question, thank you. So your lateral movement is going from user A to user B, whereas your vertical move, these users both are on the same user role and both part of the same AD groups. Your vertical movement could be going from user A to user Z, and user Z being an admin. So you move laterally around the environment, trying to learn more and more by compromising other users that are at the same level, and your vertical is going from user to admin.
Is every test tailor-made, or you have a set of routine tasks? Can you just finish the pen testing doing generic stuff without tailor-made the test?
So typically, presuming you mean tailor-made by interacting with the client, so you mean it. No, every single test would be tailor-made to a client's requirements, whether that be they just want a web application test or not. So you do have the same checks you run, but you're not going to be doing a test without speaking to the client to understand where their concerns lie. Does that answer what you? Yeah. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Yes. So I'm guessing the most boring part of them all is the reporting.
Yeah.
How automated is that? Because it looks very repetitive, but if it's very repetitive, that means a lot of things can be reused from report to report. So
yeah. So it depends on where you go. It could be a hands-on process or an automated process. What we have is we have this thing called a knowledge base, and the knowledge base has the basic information as you've mentioned written up already. So we would use that from report to report. But within the vulnerabilities, we would add in the exact specifications of the issues that we find. So it is quite a manual process by the sense of you're copying and pasting it across, but it is already written up for you there. It's just a case of adding in the specifics of the vulnerability so that the client can follow what's been found.
So it's really not that bad. Like everyone says, don't go into pen testing or don't go into ethical hacking. It's just reporting, but if it's copy pasting can be automated as well, so you might not even need to.
Yeah, exactly. The reporting isn't a bad thing. It's important to learn how to report, though. It's not a case of you want to copy and paste. There's a very specific way you want to present to the client, so you want to present it in a way that they can follow, because it's not often the report's given to a techie. It could just be that the report's provided to execs, and they need to be able to follow it at some sort of level, and then go, do you know what, give it to my IT team and they can follow it. So you need to get that balance between technical and non-technical right, so everyone can understand what it is. Perfect, that's fine. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect, no worries.
What proportion of your time would you say is taken up by reporting?
So, what proportion? You're looking at around 20% of the time is given to reporting. So you want to improperly invest time into this report, because as I mentioned, it's the deliverable that's given to the customer, and it's what they're paying for, so you want it to be a good document. It's not just given straight to them as well. I must add, it goes through a quality assurance process whereby it has another tester's set of eyes on it as well, and they can be like, no, this isn't right, or yes, that is right. That's a good finding type thing. Perfect.
Does the customer need to specify how the system or the safety of the system, or do you, as a pen tester, need to check which flows are being handled with the system? What are the gaps? Do you address them to the customer, or do you customer needs to?
So we would try to ask questions to get the customer to give us the right information. Obviously, as a tester, we don't know their complete environment. We can only try to get the information from them. Ultimately, it's about knowing how to ask the customer a question and getting the correct information from them and provide it to you, and then you can then, off the back of what they've told you, often after you ask the question to them, they come back with some information, and then that allows you to then start filling in the gaps that they've told you and then ask them more off the back of it. So your question asked how often is it given? It varies. It just depends on what the customer tells you.
Yes, I mentioned at the start for when you're doing like pre-testing with the client,
Yes.
you're introducing them to it, that tester might pass the client on to someone else.
Yes.
Does that mean that you have testers who are specifically there to introduce the client to the test beforehand? Or does everyone sort of take a bit of the process on their own?
So the process can be taken by one person all the way along, or it can just, typically the process is taken all the way along by one person. It's not often once you've spoke to a client it's then passed off to someone else, because they're used to your face, and then you've kind of created this rapport with them, and they start getting to recognise what you're saying. Does that answer?
Yeah.
Yeah, perfect.
Have you ever brought a customer network down accidentally?
Have I ever brought a customer network down accidentally? So, I'd be lying if I said I hadn't. I think it's inevitable as you test, you're going to knock stuff over. It's how you communicate with the client that has been knocked over is the important part. You don't want to hide it from them. You want to go back and say, I knocked over between this period and this period. I thought I was doing this. Could you check your logs to do this? And again, it's just engaging with them and making sure that they know that you've knocked it over, so they don't go back to the logs in like 10 weeks' time, if you keep them that long, and say this thing was over. Perfect.
You mentioned that contest will take about 5 days.
Yes.
Do you work on a single contest within those 5 days, or you can work on
So, if it was a 5-day engagement, we would work solely on that test for 5 days. It wouldn't be juggling between things. At least that's how we work at Quorum Cyber, is if you're on engagement for 5 days, you're on that engagement for 5 days, and your sole focus is this. Sorry, I'm struggling to hear you.
If you do a test against the network at that point, nothing whatsoever, is that bad or?
No, so that's a perfectly fit. So just in case the microphone never picked that up, the person was asking, if I do a pen test and nothing's found, is it a bad thing? So no, it's not a bad thing. It just demonstrates that they have a mature approach to security, and they are in the exact place where they think they should be. It's not often that does happen, however, it can happen.
Can by any chance you overlook something? If you overlook a problem?
So we're all humans. Everyone does make mistakes. It's how you go about resolving the mistakes. And I think customers, it's very rare we do miss stuff, but as I was saying, we are humans and it can happen. Perfect. I think that's all the questions. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for the Hackstock for organising security.